The only external part of the respiratory system that you can see easily is the nose, and you only see the very exterior portion of the nose. As the air flows into the nose, it passes through structures sort of between the eyes and goes back into a tube called the pharynx. The upper part of the pharynx only has air coming in through the nose. Then that tube goes down past the back of the mouth, and as it passes the back of the mouth, food can also be in that passageway. At that point, then, the food will continue on down the esophagus. We'll talk about that in the next section. But the air flows over into the larynx. The larynx is a special tube that has your epiglottis is a flap that will fold down to protect the larynx from food going into it. So when you swallow, there is the epiglottis flaps down, so the food should theoretically go straight down into your esophagus and none of it come over into your pharynx. Your voice box for creating sound is also there. As the air continues down, it now enters the trachea, goes down the trachea, and then divides into a right bronchus and a left bronchus. The bronchi continue to divide into smaller and smaller tubes, the bronchioles, until they end in very small sac structures called alveoli. Past the primary bronchi, you're really in the lungs where all the little bronchioles divide up and the alveoli are. Big picture, the functions of the respiratory system are, first of all, that is where the air comes into your body. In the lungs, the gases are exchanged. The new oxygen that you've taken in is sent into the blood, and the carbon dioxide that is the waste is let out of the blood into your lungs to be breathed out. Those exchanges all happen within the alveoli where oxygen is taken into the blood and carbon dioxide is taken out. The rest of the respiratory system are really passageways for the air to come in and go out. New air as it comes in gets purified, warmed, and humidified in the nose and the structures prior to getting to the pharynx. So you can just see more closely here, the air comes in, it's moistened and warmed, and then goes down the pharynx and then turns into the larynx to go down to the trachea. And those are all really mainly just passageways for the air to get into the lungs and out of the lungs. You do have these paranasal sinuses. They're spaces or cavities within the bones that are around the nasal cavity. The sinuses are really empty spaces, so one idea is that they actually lighten the skull. If that was solid bone, your skull could weigh quite a bit more. They also act as resonance chambers for speech. If your paranasal sinuses are all clogged up and the air can't resonate through them, your voice sounds very different, and you know that a little bit from hearing yourself when you have a lot of sinus activity where you've got mucus in your sinuses. Normally, all of those cavities are lined with mucus-producing cells. That the mucus is there to capture any kind of foreign things that come in through the air, and theoretically, it will drain those captured foreign objects out of those nasal cavities so that they're not affecting your sinuses. The lungs occupy most of the thoracic cavity, and the lungs are divided into lobes. So on the right side you can see 3 lobes, and on the left side 2 lobes to the lung. The lungs are surrounded by a covering that is called the pleura. The pleura has two layers. The first, the one that's right on the outside of the lungs, it clings to the very outside of the lungs, is called the visceral layer or the visceral pleura. There is an outer layer called the parietal layer or the parietal pleura that actually attaches to the walls of the thoracic cavity. Under normal conditions, there isn't a lot of space between the visceral and the parietal layers, but there is a fluid that fills that area to allow the two layers to glide relative to each other. This is really important in that, in fact, breathing is about volume differences in your thoracic cavity, and it's the pleura actually pulling or pushing on the surface of the lungs that help them retain their shape. Just a picture of as the primary bronchi branch further and further into smaller and smaller, it's almost like tree branches. The very smallest branches of the bronchi, you can see here, are called bronchioles, and they end in these little sacs called alveoli. The alveoli are very thin little sacs which fill with air, and they are surrounded by blood vessels, and that's where gas exchange actually happens. So now we're looking at a close-up of, kind of a cartoon of a close-up of one of the walls of the alveolus, and here's the blood vessels. So air is getting exchanged from this alveolus to the blood, and you can see that the layers, there's just a plasma membrane of the alveolus, and then the plasma membrane of the capillary, and oxygen and carbon dioxide can be exchanged pretty easily across those two very thin layers. There's two other kinds of cells in this picture that I want you to notice. These little green ones are surfactant secreting cells. Surfactant is a fluid that lines the alveoli and stops them from collapsing completely. Also, you may see these little macrophages. Remember from the immune chapter that macrophages are a non-specific immune surveillance. So they're in the lungs because the lungs are exposed to a lot of outside stuff, and they're ready to start a general non-specific immune reaction against anything that gets in those lungs.